Hello and welcome to this lecture on Adobe Illustrator by Eduonics Technologies. In this lecture we're going to be going into colors, fills, strokes, some of the more basic features of those. This lecture will go with the next one, in which we're also covering various fills and strokes, some of the more advanced features. But for just right now we're going to take a look at the strokes panel, the color panel, the gradient panel, and how those can be used. First up is the strokes panel, and I'm going to draw a quick shape here just to give you an idea. It's always a square. I'm going to make it a diamond. Anyway, this shape has a white fill and a black stroke, as you can see down here. Now the stroke panel lets me specify the weight of the stroke. That's 5 points. I can also go in here and click up or down on the arrows. Now if I click down and shift, that goes up by 5 points. I'm sorry, 10 points each time. But I'm just going to type in 5. It'll know points automatically. Now I'm going to zoom in here so you can see some of the other features of the strokes panel. Which, by the way, the strokes panel is located up here in Window like all the other panels. It's Control F10 or Command F10 on a Mac. So I just turned Pixel Preview off so you can see a little bit more clearly. Right now we have it set to butt caps and miter joins, which give it the appearance of this sharp corner, as you can see right here. If I were to set this to round joins, it'll give it a rounded appearance. And if I were to set this to bevel joins, it'll give it a beveled appearance. And notice it's doing this on all the sides. Now if this wasn't a complete shape, for instance if this were just a couple lines or an open shape, we can change the cap to a round cap or a projecting cap. You pay attention to the anchor. On a normal cap, it stops right at the anchor, but on a round cap, it rounds it off past. And on a projecting cap, it cuts it off past the point. And the amount that it rounds it is based on if there was a little circle right here where I'm drawing my mouse. So the diameter of the circle is actually the weight of the line, and that's basically how it determines the rounded ends as well as the corners. Now with rounded corners, it changes how round it is based on how wide the corner is. As you can see, that's almost a square corner, almost a sharp regular corner. And there's also I don't know if I can reproduce it right now, but see right here, this should be a point. It should come all the way out to here actually. This is right here is the miter limit, and if you roll this back, if you ever have something that's being cut off unnecessarily, and you know that's supposed to be a sharp angle just like the rest of these, then you would just play with your miter limit here. It's set at 10, normally I set it to 13, and it put the cap back on. So that is your strokes panel. It controls the stroke in pretty much every way. There's also the dashed line, which is pretty easy to understand. If you just click it, it automatically puts in a 12-point dash. Now if I were to select a 6-point gap, as you can see the dash is twice as long as the gap. So it's pretty easy how to use this. And if you notice, there's two options right here. Right now with this option on, all the corners are equal as far as how much dotted line they have, and it averages it out in between the corners. This is actually a pretty cool option as it makes your dotted lines look very well drawn. But you can also select this option, which is a little bit more, I don't know what you call it, authentic. But this changes the shape just a little bit, this option, just so everything lines up really nicely. So that's the one on the left. If you can see that pop up, it says aligns dashes to corners and path ends, adjusting lengths to fit. So I guess that'd be the best explanation. So we've learned a little bit about stroke. Let's learn about fill. And learning about fill involves learning about color. Oh, and one last thing on stroke with a closed shape before we go into fill. With a closed shape on something, and this is really handy. I'm going to turn the dash line off so you can see. We can set the alignment of the stroke to the inside of our line, of our paths and anchors, to the outside of our paths and anchors, or on default, it goes both out and in equally. So I'll just zoom in here if you can't see that right now. That's how the stroke is oriented, with the line equally outside and inside of it. And when I click this option, it's all inside. When I click this option, it's all outside. You can see the line is right here. So without further ado, let's get into fills. First off, over here where I would double click to bring up the color picker, I have some options. I can switch this fill so that there's a white stroke and a black fill. That's what this button does. Right down here, we'll bring up the default fill and stroke, also shortcut key D, which is a 1-point black line, which, as you can see, align to center, miter join, butt cap, 1 point with a white fill, pure white, hex code FFFFFF, and pure black, hex code 000000 to be precise. So that's the default, and that's really great to use for when you want 100% white, 100% black, for instance. Now down here, if I click this, it'll clear out whatever's currently selected, if it's the stroke or if it's the fill. So I have the stroke selected because it's in front. If I click it, it'll get rid of it. Or if I have the fill selected, if I click it, it will get rid of it. So now this object just has a stroke. So let's select color. When I double click on that box, fill box, or the stroke box, it'll bring up the color picker. Right now, as you can see, it's set to black, 0000, so on. It also gives a CMYK approximation of black. I'm working in an RGB color space, so I don't want to use that. If I were to want to use a black, it would be the RGB version of black, which would be 000. If I wanted white, I would type in 255, 255, 255. That will give me the code FFFFF. So we would be using these in RGB, and we would be using these in CMYK. If we were in a CMYK document, K stands for black, Y is yellow, this is magenta, and this is cyan, or cyan. Get it confused with the pepper. This is kind of like a light blue, this is magenta, and this is yellow. And K stands for black. In CMYK, you actually enter your black. There's some things to know about that a little bit later when we get into gradients. So right now I'm going to pick a color. You can click anywhere in this window. It will display also all the stats over here, or you can enter in directly. I only do that when I'm using a company's color and it has to be, perfect. And sometimes when I have a color in mind, or when it's for web, like this hex code right here is used for web typically. It's also tied into RGB. So anyway, let's say I want a yellow. It's that very narrow bandwidth. It's a perfect yellow. I want a little bit of a gold to it. And let's make it dark and saturated. If you move this direction, it's unsaturated. And if you move this direction, it's more saturated. If you move up, it's lighter, and if you move down, it's darker, basically. So these two warnings right here, I'm going to ignore those because web colors can display more than this gamut will let you believe, depending on the application. And this out of gamut warning is irrelevant to me because I'm not printing. But this basically means it's out of the typical CMYK color gamut. This means it's outside of the typical web color gamut. And if you want to be safe, just go ahead and click those. I click the web one since I'm doing RGB for web. And I'm going to click OK. I know that color can display nicely on the web, which uses typically around 255, I think, colors. But nowadays they use more than that, so you can actually get away with not clicking that generally if you're working for screen or web. Anyway, you see how the color picker tool works. Simply by double clicking on any of these, I can bring it up for that particular shape. And if I want to store my colors, I simply go into swatches. Swatches has a bunch of default colors to start with. So what I'm going to do first is make a new color group. I'm going to call it 121, whatever. So as you can see, that made a new color group based on, and I should show you the options real quick. It gives you the options of a name to create from selected artwork, which is why it created a black and a yellow, because I had that selected, or selected swatches. I could select a bunch of swatches up here, maybe ones I already created that got mixed in, and I could reorganize them into a new color group. So I'm going to click cancel. So one thing you can do with swatches panels, you can drag colors around. So that leads me into gradients. There's a gradient tool and a gradient panel. If you don't see the gradient panel, it's up here under window. Just scroll down to gradient. There. So now with my gradient panel up, it's also usually in the same box as color and swatches for convenience because it'll also do the color. When I click this, I see that the default has a black and a white with a little slider in between that determines how close each one is, how much each one has. It's set to 50% by default down here. There we go, now you should be able to see everything more clearly. Now make sure whenever you're doing a gradient that it's not doing it for the stroke, although it can do it for the stroke, which is a new feature to CS6, possibly one of the later CS5s. If you notice, I have a gradient on my stroke. I'm going to hit swap here so that it'll swap it, give it the yellow stroke with a, I'm going to get rid of the shape back here. So now I have a gradient, it's the basic gradient. If I want to edit it, I can go to the gradient panel, and I can move these around and enter numbers and coordinates for this, but it's much easier to just edit it using the gradient tool. When I click the gradient tool over here, or hit shortcut key G, it brings up this, and there's a box and a circle. And as you see, there's also sliders. And I can turn this gradient as well. I can reposition it. Play around with the gradient tool because there's a lot you can do with it. I'm going to show you most of that with radial. Let's say your shape is this long, but you want your radial gradient to fit evenly in between. And by the way, this is the only other option for gradients in Illustrator. So I just pretty much showed you linear. It's pretty easy to do. Now I'm going to show you radial. And for each one, you can drag with the gradient tool. So I'm going to want to start it off right from where it is, in the center. And normally I would just drag out to this edge, but I'm going to drag this handle instead. Now, if you look up here at top, there's a little black circle. My cursor looks like this when I'm over it. When you touch that, drag it, it will bring the gradient down to a nice even oval. So that's the gradient tool in a nutshell. Just like with the line tool, or I'm sorry, just like with the linear gradient tool, the radial gradient tool can be turned. You can mess around with the sliders. And you can make it bigger or smaller, which is all what you'd be doing with this panel right here anyway. Now, let's just take a quick look at how we have put colors in the gradient panel. I've already told you that the swatches panel, you can easily organize all your color groups. So, let's say I also wanted this color and a new custom color. So I'd want to save my gradient first, let's say, after I make it. I'm going to drag this color, this green color, because that's what I want my gradient to be, green and yellow. I'm going to drag it over to the gradient tab. If this was in another panel, you'd simply drag it over to the other panel. And when I'm on that tab, the gradient tab, with my color still holding the mouse button, I'm going to drop it right here where you see that little symbol pop up on the icon. Now I can go over to swatches and grab my yellow, drag it up to the gradient tab, and I'll show you if it was on a different thing right here. You would just drag it straight down to here. I'm going to put that on my white. So now I have this cool little yellow gradient on the inside here, rounded, nice and even with my rectangular box because I changed the shape of it using the gradient tool. So that's how you use the gradient and the swatches tool in general. There's a few more things, like you can show all color swatches, gradient swatches, pattern, or color groups. We'll get into some more of these later in the next video. I choose to keep it on show all swatches. That way I can have any gradient that I create, which I would create by clicking new swatch. Call this Brazil. It'll keep it right up here for me. I can't drag this down to my group. It'll give me an error, but since you can always make this box bigger, you'll never have a problem with running out of room for colors, honestly. I never use more than about 12 custom colors in a design, and if in an illustration, maybe if it's really elaborate, I'll use 100 or so. So you can do everything with your swatches panel in its default mode generally. Another thing to look at is there are lots of libraries built into Illustrator. I'm not going to go into each one of these, but there's gradients. This is a good one. There's a lot of different gradients, and you can tell based on the names of what they're for. I think that one I actually downloaded. But there's, and wood, I believe I downloaded. But if you take a look in there, there's things like metals, which is pretty cool, gems and jewels, which I'm sure you get the idea of that. And there's all kinds of other things in here. So just take a look at your swatches, what's built in. Color books, these are all the Pantone colors. If you ever need to find a Pantone color, and you have the number, which would be like a PMS 123 color or something like that, you would look in here under coded or uncoded depending on what stock you're using. So that's about the best things about these buttons down here. Is the new swatch, which will create a new gradient, new pattern, new fill, new anything. Put it in its appropriate category. Delete swatch, which you probably know what that does, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So that's going to wrap it up for this video, and stay tuned. We're going to learn a little bit more about color and a little bit more about fill and stroke manipulating them, and we're going to get into the amazing, wonderful eyedropper tool. So thanks for watching.